Right, rook and pawn versus rook, in the case of it being a rook's pawn. I already said in the last video where the king was in front of a 7th rank rook's pawn, how it's pretty extreme, the circumstances where the side with the rook's pawn is actually able to win it. If the king is in front of a 7th rank rook's pawn, then you need the defending king to be cut off by 4 files before you can win it, and we demonstrated the winning procedure in the last video. Anything fewer than 4 files and you can't win it. The other situation is where the rook is in front of the pawn. Sadly for black, if that pawn has already gone to the 7th rank, it is going to be a draw, providing white plays the correct next move, and it's a very easy draw to understand. Once you've understood why that's an easy draw, you'll see in a minute that black's going to be like, oh no, why did I push that pawn to the 7th rank? I should have left it on the 6th rank. And then the defensive procedure that you're about to see here for white wouldn't work, and we need something completely different. It's much more difficult. It's not super difficult, but it is more difficult than this. It's more complicated than this. It's called the Vancura defense, and that's why I've called this video not the Vancura defense, because it doesn't seem to have a name for it. But once the pawn's got to the 7th rank, it's a very easy one to defend. It's not the Vancura defense yet. And again, this looks like pretty extreme circumstances. You might be thinking, well, why do I need to worry about this? I can't remember if I've ever had a game of chess where I've got my pawn to the 7th rank and got my rook stuck in front of it. And it's actually more common than you'd think. Not necessarily just rook and pawn versus rook, but all the ideas that I'm going to cover now and the ideas I'm going to cover in the Vancura defense video, which I'm going to make next, they're all important ideas that are then relevant if there are pawns on this side of the board. They usually set themselves up in this wave formation, and there's a reason for that, which I'll get onto. And I mean, there is just so much to be said about that position there with the pawns on those squares. Is not necessarily the black king as advanced as this, but the black king back on e6, say, is one of the most, or g7 even, is one of the most studied positions in all of rook endgame theory. It's like opening Pandora's box, to be honest. But fundamental to all of it, like, is the ideas that are going to get covered in this video and the next video. They're there basically the entire time as core knowledge that you have to have, that makes you understand some of the bizarre looking moves in those later positions. So yes, this particular position with just one pawn left, you might be unlikely to get, but with other pawns on the board, all the ideas are there. And you might also be thinking, how on earth did I get my rook stuck in front of the pawn? And again, it's probably come from, if there are pawns still on the board back here, all that's happened is that the white rook has come and attacked your last remaining pawn. We've got 3-on-3 on the king side and a passed pawn on the queen side. The defending side attacks that pawn from behind, and it might just have been that it wasn't preferable, or you couldn't actually do it at the time. Imagine if a black rook was actually on e1, they couldn't defend on e2 because the king would take it. So lateral defense either wasn't possible or wasn't desirable, and I know the pawn might have been back on a5 at the time, and the attacking rooks just defended it from the front and then shuffled that pawn forward. So it's a more common setup than you might think. I've had it in games. I had it actually in the Belper Club Championship. I won't say who against, but in my first season playing in the Belper Club Championship, I've had it in a congress down in Tunbridge Wells, and there were pawns on the board, but I was aware of the ideas that I'm about to go through here. Anyway, that was me waffling on for ages, so you've probably solved this and gone on to the next puzzle, waiting for me to finish talking, but you can still pause the video if you want. It's white to play. What would you do here? White has only one drawing move, and the first thing you might have worked out, hopefully, I say this is fairly okay to work out, is you've got to bring your king to the 2nd rank, because black is threatening check on wherever your king is and promoting that pawn, which is just a win. If you bring your king to the second rank, that prevents that check. You just take that rook and then you take the queen, or you take the a2 pawn, and white would win that, bizarrely. So, you know, once you brought your king to the second rank, black is not going to put your king in check. But the next thing is that a very natural move you might think to play here is like, oh my word, you know, this black king is coming in to defend, and then the rook's away, and then you know, black can promote that pawn. I've got to bring my king over to help. So if you hadn't seen this position before, or hadn't spent too long thinking about it, you might play king e2, which completely blunders the game away, because black just plays rook h1, and you cannot take on a2 because you lose your rook. The same would be true for king f2, rook h1. So you've got to bring your king to the second rank, and you've got to put it in a place where black hasn't got this rook h1 trick. So that's your drawing move, king g2. And you know, you might have been reluctant to play that because, oh my word, the black king's coming in, but you just do nothing. You just keep your rook on the a file, and as soon as the black king makes contact with the a2 pawn, black is now threatening to get that rook out. You just check the black king until next week, and then come back to the a file. It is so simple. It is such a simple drawing maneuver. Black has got nothing. There's just no way to break this very simple defense. Yeah, and it's a draw. As soon as they make contact with the b pawn, check. Check, 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 check. And then when they haven't made contact with the b pawn, you just come back to the a file. You just move your rook back and forth on the a file and just leave your king on g2. Just don't touch your king. Now, an interesting sort of consequence of that is that if black had a g7 pawn, that changes nothing. You just ignore it. All that g7 pawn can do is come down to g3. And it's still just a draw. If instead black had an h7 pawn, you just put your king on h2, because this whole drawing procedure also works with the king on h2, and you do nothing. And all that h pawn can do is come down to h3. So it's still a draw. If, however, black has an f pawn, black's won, because you do your drawing, you know, maneuver. We might get into this position, for example, and black doesn't need to play king moves. If they've got an f pawn, they'll just march it down the board, and eventually you have to deal with it. If you take it on f3, we've got rook f1 check and promotes. If you block it on f2 or take it on f2, well, I don't know how you could actually get to taking it on f2 without already having gone up to the third rank, but if you block it on f2 here, then black plays the rook h1 trick. So yeah, that's why in this particular setup, when you have got pawns on this side of the board, and you know, we'll cover all this sort of stuff in later videos when I eventually get around to it, in this rook endgames mountain project that I'm going through, there's lots of subtleties around the side with the, well, black will be trying to create a passed f pawn, even if it ends up losing the other two pawns in some circumstances. And it can get very, very complicated. There's just a world of study on that. But let's just keep it simple in this video. Not the Vancura defense. It's called not the Vancura defense because, well, it's not actually called that. I've called it that because there isn't really a name for this defensive procedure. It's just the rook's in front of a 7th rank rook's pawn, and it's a draw. By what I've just shown you, just stick your king on g2 and just keep your rook on the a file until black makes contact, and then you just check, 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 check. If you were the black side here, and this pawn had come from a5 earlier on, you might now be thinking, oh, I wish I hadn't moved my pawn from a3 down to a2, because then when all these checks come in, I'd have the a2 square as shelter. Okay, so when the black pawn hasn't made it all the way to the 7th rank, or in the 2nd rank in this case, or black 7th rank, a2, black's got winning ideas of sheltering the king on a2, and this defensive procedure won't work against that. And you need something completely different, which is called the Vancura defense, and I'll cover that in another video. But let's just test out this, what I claim is a very simple defensive procedure. I think we can all just learn this. I don't think it matters how good you are, to be honest. I think this isn't difficult. It's a very simple defensive procedure. Let's look at some games and see if we can apply it. So this is a game from 1990. It is white to play. Pause the video and decide what would you do next. Your king's already on g2. This is an extremely simple draw. Rook takes f7 check, king g4, rook a7. You just leave your h and your g pawns, don't care about them. So take the h and the g pawns, I really don't care. I'm just going to move my rook back and forth on the a file. Remember, this g pawn is totally useless because we're just leaving our king on g2 and moving the rook back and forth on the a file. The only thing you might think of why that might change things is you could say, yeah, okay, this pawn's useless to me in terms of helping me promote this, but it is a pawn, you know, and I can now get my rook out, just let the a2 pawn go, and I've still got this pawn, this g pawn, but that's a knight's pawn. Okay, so when black gets their rook out, we just take on a2, and even if we can't get the Philidor set up, I reckon we probably can. I reckon we're going to get the Philidor set up anyway. We've got first rank defense, and in fact, we've got, because we're taking on a2 and our king's already on the second rank, we've got second rank defense. We could do first rank defense against the knight's pawn on the second rank, so it's an easy draw. I think this was an actual game. Black went king h5, rook a8, g5, rook a7, and they just agreed to draw. Sorry, it was an actual game, sorry, but I think that was the actual game moves. Right, another game from 1990. This one's a bit more interesting. Pause the video, it's black to play, and decide what would you do here. And well done if you came up with, which is what the player with the black pieces in the game did, the very simple, just get your king back to b7. It's slightly different here because you're thinking, hang on, weren't you covering this in the next video? This h pawn hasn't made its way to h7. But the point is that we've got a d pawn that we can use in the meantime. The white king is cut off on the first rank by this rook, and it can't come across to attack the rook so easily because this d pawn just gets pushed, and when the rook comes and sorts that out, then we can just come and nab the h pawn, whether it's on h6 or h7. So in the game, king b6 was played, b5, king back to b7. White played h7, and that sort of makes it definitely drawn now. We don't even need our d pawn. We could just immediately start playing any old rook move on the h file. But you might be wondering, okay, why doesn't white try and sort of keep that trump in his pocket with b6? And because this pawn hasn't reached the 7th rank yet, then we can just take that b pawn. I mean, there are other drawing moves, but then when the h pawn gets pushed, then you have to come back to b7, or a7, in fact, would have been fine. Yeah, the problem is that white doesn't really have any moves other than that. So in the game, the h pawn was pushed, king a7, b6 check, king b7, king came across to e1, and black just pushed the d pawn. Okay, king d1, d2. The king came out to c2, and yeah, black just got rid of the d pawn. He just doesn't need it, and it's just completely drawn. And finally, one more game. Actually, I say finally one more game. There's something interesting to show about this position that we're just in the middle of. King takes b4 is obviously a disaster because of h7, so please, hopefully nobody played that. But there is actually a second sneaky little drawing maneuver. Remember that if white pushes the h pawn, they're going to play a check, and then h8 equals queen, and that's why you had to get your king back to b7. But there's quite a lot of sort of cover around here which the black king could use and king c4 is still a draw. h7, and you come into d3. So you're sheltering yourself from the checks. White runs away from the checkmate with king c1, but then you've got this sneaky little transfer of the rook via a check back up to the 7th rank. So you're still hitting the pawn, and white can't get the rook out. And when the king comes up, your king can then take shelter on the c file. So that was an inventive way to draw it. And sorry, yeah, now I will get onto this game. So this game's from 2005. It is white to play. There's not really any pause the video moments yet. White should have just taken the pawn, and I mean, I'll go through the rest of the moves that, if you like, should have happened in a sec. But in the game, white got flashy. Okay, based on the idea that this rook coming over to deliver a check anywhere and then promoting this pawn is just going to be an easy win for white, they tried to get this black king out into the open by playing g5. Okay. And you know, there are good ideas behind this. If black plays king takes g5, then white wins, rook g8 check. But you could pause the video here if you wanted to. Black to play. You just had g5 played against you. You can see the idea. But has white just blundered there? Sorry. Because well, I can play king takes h5, and I've still got shelter. But then white goes again. It's like, how clever, how clever. But not clever. White's chucked away the win. What does black play here? If you take the pawn with the pawn, rook h8 check. If you take the pawn with the king, rook g8 check. If you leave the pawn, it's just going to take on h7 or come through to g7. If you take with the rook, your rook's out because the rook's no longer hitting a7. Why is this not just a really clever way to finish off the game? Bosh. I don't know at what point the white player with the white pieces saw that, but if it was me and I played g5, I can tell you when I would have seen king h6. I'd have played g5, and then I would have been like, oh, I guarantee it. I would have seen king h6 as soon as I took as soon as I touched the g pawn. I would have seen king h6 as I played it, and then just been like, oh my god. What have I done here? Why didn't I just take the pawn on d5? Yeah, king h6. This is what happened in the game. Then white took on d5, but black just brought their king back to g7. And now they can take on g6 with the pawn if they want to. White took on h7, king takes h7, king c5, rook a1. Contact with the pawn is made, and you start the checking, and they agree to draw here. What white should have done is just take this pawn. I mean, there are lots of ways for white to win this, but the same idea actually could have been used as the quickest way to go about it. So take the pawn, rook has to sort of go somewhere on the a file. King takes g4 is obviously poisoned at any given stage because of rook g8 check. But it's not just a simple case of coming over to collect the h pawn. Rook there check, king f7. I mean, there is a weird triangulation thing you could do with king e7, but king f7 is absolutely fine. And when the rook goes back to a1, I think king g7 is still a win. I'm pretty sure it is. It's not on the engine's top 5 moves. Let me just try that. Yeah, I mean, it's still 1, but, you know, you're going to end up with an a and an h pawn, because as soon as king g7 is played, black can take your g pawn. So, a better way to win it from here, arguably, is to push the h pawn. Black just has to do nothing and wait around on the a file, and then go for this g5 push idea. g5, black might come back with a rook, and you can still just push. or if king back to h5, we can still just push g6. So it still works, even if for some bizarre reason the rook and the king were guarding. Let's just play some silly moves. Here we can still just play g6. So that, I mean, it wasn't the only way to win it, but in the original position, white's clearly trying to use the tactic of getting the black king out into the open for a check and then promoting the a-pawn, which is a good idea. But they should have just, in the endgame, do not hurry. Just take this pawn, because if that idea wins, you can still do it in a minute. This g-pawn isn't being attacked because of the idea that you're sort of obviously aware of, which is why you're doing this g5 flashy move. But this flashy move missed this defense. Oops. Anyway, that's not the Vancura defense. Very simple drawing procedure, and yeah, hope you like that.